Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and as always, I thank you for being here. If you are new or returning, I do hope that you stay and enjoy either way. I do apologize if this week the audio sounds a little bit different. I actually am displaced from my home right now, and the last couple days, unfortunately, we're dealing with some landlord-tenant stuff. So I did not bring my normal microphone because I didn't think we were going to be out of the home for as long as we are, but I at least have my headphones. Um, all that being said, of course, I also invite you to join me over on Patreon. I add lots of things over there, and of course, I am excited to grow our little circle and just have a good time with all things magic, from further necromancy deep dives to curated monthly spells and recipes, or even just go ahead and give me a follow on Instagram. As always, everything will be in the description. It is Between Two Worlds, but between II Worlds on Instagram. Now, anyway, to get into today's topic, which I'm very excited about, I wanted to talk about some practical shit today, honestly, and have a nice fun convo on hot and cold magic and even sweetening things up and souring things and talk about bittering things throughout magic. I want to just really have some fun talking about not just how it changes the relationships of the working or between you and a spirit, but generally changes the conditioning of the working, whether it is between you and another person, a spirit, a relationship, or situation. Now, these are things we already are really used to hearing or speaking about on our own terms, just between us humans. If you really think about it, you often hear things like keeping a cool head or having a heated argument, giving someone the cold shoulder or warm welcomes, or even sweetening the deal when making a transaction or negotiating. But there is a more useful way to actually apply these things to our magic. Sometimes we do it without even realizing what we're doing, and sometimes, we very much purposely do it. Now, before I go on talking about more practical or technical uses, I of course dug up where we can trace some of this back. If, we just start with hot and cold for now, I want you to think about this sort of dial that controls speed and state of your magic or working. Now, this can be thought of with all things moving or still, so agitated or even numb. Then there is the sweetening or souring or bittering of a working. This is more classically thought of as those honey jars or the sweetening jars or even vinegar jars, or the classic conjure of hot foot magic and your cutesy little Pinterest freezer spells everyone has seared into their brains. And in the Diffictionis, we have a good old persuasive analogy. So using this similibus, there's a lot of illas in there, but it's basically a rhetorical device for fixing your magic to the logic of like affects like. This is our clearest answer to sympathetic magic. So, for example, you speak and enliven one thing, say your target, and describe it with the qualities or effects as the counterpart. So, blank is as silent and cold and hidden away from the sun as this blank, say corpse or grave or tomb or something. Now, just an example. As much as the actual curse tablets go, the curse was put on the enemy to be as useless as the tablet itself actually was. So, the thing that it is, to represent that target. So, just as we reach for things like cinnamon or cayenne pepper or boiling water, things that are physically hot or hot working, or again, that freezer spell, the PGM has an example of this with a love spell to be burning with passion and love. There are a lot of, these leading or drawing spells that were actually mostly used by men, and they are used or categorized as agage spells, really meant to drag the one they loved to him. Now, the incantations themselves were purposely filled with very intense language in these, well, I guess, analogies to keep the target burning with desire, even physically ailed within the charm. Now, there is also humoral theory I want to mention. Now, this ran as more of the dominant medical framework. Yes, I'm going to get into some medical stuff, but just hear me out. This will have a purpose. So, in the West, for almost 1600 years, This theory begins appearing in the Hippocratic Medical Corpus. Then Galen expanded it later in Rome. This of course started in Greece with Hippocrates, but it traveled very quickly and wasn't really ever questioned. It was actually taught straight through the Renaissance. It went through the Islamic Golden Age and went through some expansion there and back to Christian Europe through Latin translations of those Arabic texts. So by the time we look at medieval European medicine, it's a many expanded and very well traveled, well, Greek theory. But I digress. The point is, it didn't stay put. The four humors are probably, something more of you know. This is the theory that our bodies are made up of four fluids, so blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Then in turn, the imbalances in those is what results in sickness. And each of these were associated with a sort of heat. Blood is hot and moist, phlegm is cold and moist, yellow, white, while hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. Now, Galen actually introduced the grading of these temperatures, which acted more like dispositions on hot and cold when it came to things like even the herbs. We have heard of hot herbs, cooling herbs, right? So think of this ladder of intensity. Each plant and root or substance has a rating on it. Hot in the first degree is more gentle, something like chamomile. It is gently warming and it corrects something like a mild chill in the body. So by the fourth degree, it is more like something that burns on contact. Then there is cold, so something like opium would sit at cold and dry in the fourth degree, very, very strong, which obviously we know, cooling things, bringing the body down so slowly that the heart rate actually drops and well, you know what happens then, cooling off these activities within the body and, bringing things to just as slow. And really, it could just shut the whole body down in this such of a high degree. Now, the dry part is referring to it being very astringent. So, the degrees of something being dry is binding or having the contracting nature, which of course makes opium so dangerous because it's very um, cool and dry. Things ranked within dry, of course, will dry things up. Excessive moisture or fluids within the body, or just shrivel and prune on the extreme degrees. So it just actually contracts and like blood vessels constrict. Now, hot, are things that blister. They are caustic. They, of course, ramp things up. Wet or moist will be things that encourage the flow or production of fluids. I guess just general fluidity. But also, this can be destructive, especially in raw materials like mercury or more gentler. Uh, I think of things like okra or slippery elm. These promote this sort of wetness or fluidity. Now, back to why the fuck I'm even bringing up this old ass medical stuff is it has to do with how and what you do with your magic and with what herbs or materia that you use, especially when talking folk magic. The physician who ordered you to take a tincture of ginger for this ailment or even use the opium he prescribed you relays the same reasonings within magic and their uses for folk medicine and eventually practices, right? It was known that cinnamon or ginger was hot. It was known that cayenne and sulfur had these functions physically as they did metaphysically for hot footwork and conjure or root work. The reputations or agitation or driving the sickness out could be used to drive someone away out of your life, split from something. Something cold enough to actually shut the body down on a physical level was cold enough to slow a situation down in a working because why the fuck not, sympathetic magic. So in the PGM, the prayer to Selene for any spell gives us a good example of how there are two different ways of doing something for a result of harm and one benevolent. So, burning myrrh, sage, frankincense, and I think it was like a fruit pit for sweet things that bring comfort. Then, of course, the materials of blood from someone who died violently, remains of a dog, and I think it was like a goat or something. It is two ways of application for one working. So in American conjure and European cutting crafts, there are familiar sweetening works like the honey jars or using molasses and sugar for getting favors, and then the vinegar work for souring situations or making something generally unpleasant. But these things being used just for their innate qualities because we just know something is sweet or we just know something tastes bitter isn't just enough for magic. It is about understanding what the condition is doing. So going back to the cinnamon example, because it's the easiest right now. We know it's hot, but we need to not only understand the degree of how hot it is, but what it is doing. So if you begin to treat it as an actual operation, I guess, then you can really apply it to a lot of different things that you maybe didn't first understand how to. So you aren't using it just because it is, quote, a hot ingredient. You are actually using it because, your goal is to accelerate things, the timing, the speed of something, or you want to intensify and inflame the person, the spirit, or situation. Heat brings stimulation. And like when you have ginger after a meal to stimulate your digestive system, like I have that all the time, and really get things working. And, that's why it's important to understand the qualities of the materials that you're using throughout historical medicine, because it was known, what increased the circulation, what provoked sweating, or even stimulated appetites. If certain things could expel ailments from the body and be used to provoke bodily movements or functions, like chilies or even cutting onions, of course, they irritate and they provoke your senses into a heightened state. Sometimes so much that you can be distracted, like bear spray. What happens when you spray it? That shit is extremely irritating. It scares them off. It is agitating to their senses. So for me, it's really important to go back and look at the degrees of where things belong material-wise, whether they're cold and dry, whether they're hot and wet, all those certain things and which degree they fall on actually can affect how and what you use within your magic. Now, on the topic of heat, because I'm just started talking about it, it can even be used for transformation. Now, this is obvious when it comes to working with, of course, fire, but it doesn't always have to be used with burning something to ash to actually transform it. So, the correspondence of the thing is going to, of course, tell you its category, where it belongs, but the operation of it is what is actually telling you what you are trying to make happen. Now, when we talk about what magic we are, often doing, it's very target focused. We have these goals or wants and needs, and even go as far as actually saying things out loud, like, I want this person to love me. I want this person to leave me alone. I want this job by next week, or I want this spirit to help me. But within magic, the thing we manipulate is not always the person itself or the thing itself. It's all about perspective here. So, good and even effective magic is often about manipulating the environment or I guess the things around what you want to change. It is making the small changes that influence the big ones. So number one, it's always easier to make small changes first, of course, but think of like the drop of a stone in a pond, it affects the entire reflection. You've of course heard of the butterfly effect. If you just put in one little influence and someone's just barely there, they can, of course, it's inviting them to spiral into it and then, eventually make the decision that you wanted them to make. Now, for a person, and I'm just going to list some common things here. And since we are on the topic of heat, we're going to run with it. You can increase desire. You are warming them up, spicing up the things that make their heart flutter, warming yourself up even to create that inviting feeling where you make them want you. Increasing motivation is another big one. So, feeding the initial motivation for something and then inflating it, causing this inflammation, this increase of something. Heat can be applied to situations of anger, of course, but also courage. When you're feeling hot, you tend to have a lot more courage, right? You are like, oh, yeah, hey, I will go ahead on that person. Or, I don't care. I'm going to go do this instead of that. You sort of like get this alter ego when you're feeling good, when you're feeling hot and spiced up. Now, within relationships, heat can be applied to increasing the passion and the intimacy, but also intensifying conflict. Many times when doing workings of breaking two people up or a relationship of some sort that you want to intensify the conflict with, whether that one person has your job and is buddy buddy with your boss and you want that instead, I'm not making any assumptions here. Just another possibility. But you could make them argue more, hate each other more resentment, so they make the decision to call it quits. Now, a very traditional hoodoo working for causing discourse is to fight like cats and dogs. So taking these two polar opposites and using them to invite the arguments in, using the actual materia of the two animals in the working. So heating up a working increases activity, of course. It matters where you apply it to, but you can make something more forceful and can even push something toward that final manifestation by heating it up, putting that flame under your ass, basically. Now, when it comes to heating things up with spirits, often the goal is to increase its activity, make it work for you faster, more efficiently in the ideal. Definitely be careful not to overheat something. You don't want it acting like the guests in Hot Ones. It's being like so distracted and heated up that it just can't focus anymore. But it's provoking it like a little bit, right? You are kind of provoking it, kind of reaching out, like sending that email after email, or when someone texts you and texts you and texts you, or calls you and calls you and calls you, what does it do to the person on the other end? Very often, I know what that feels like for sure. And usually you get fired up. You get fired up in a way that kind of pisses you off, but it forces your hand to keep the situation moving because you just want it to end. Now, in Palamonte, there's actually the use of spiritual heat. It describes hot peppers being added to the nganga. I think that's how you say it. Don't judge me. To give it this sort of heat. So to actually stimulate the spirit and keep it from becoming dormant. So again, this is something that you could apply within your own sort of spirit court. Now, heat can be also applied to gaining the attention of a spirit. So maybe like intensifying its interactions or general attraction to you. Often I find spirits are attracted to things of such intensity. So whether it be strong smells or sounds or actions, even tastes, it just makes sense, why that attraction oil filled with these hot plants or herbs and materials also would work on spirits. Now, when it comes to working with changing this temperature, I guess, is what we're going to refer to it in this episode, with spirit, I think it's important to truly think of all the details. So, not just you want to heat up a relationship with the spirit, but what that actually means. We can heat the spirit itself, like I just mentioned, making it more active itself, such as filling your spirit houses or containers or effigies or bottles or, with things that keep it warmed enough to keep things moving, or heating yourself up in relation to the spirit. So, making your own perception sharper, your attention or devotion to be increased or with the spirit, your receptivity to be stronger or more intense toward the spirit or spirits. You can heat up and increase interactions with spirits, like increasing those dreams, the communications, and signs to be more frequent. This is entirely more focused on creating conditions in which you, the practitioner, becomes more capable of perceiving the spirit. Now, the point is, before choosing which route to go, I guess, you need to know what part of the situation you are actually trying to change, but then all the different roads to get there. And honestly, this is one of the best things and what's so fun about magic. There are a million ways to do one thing. You are filled with not just materials like your herbs, but also your actions. It's thinking about what we can physically do and perform to make the thing that we are working experience what we want it to be experiencing. So, back to our sympathetic and contagion magic. There's actions that we can do, like boiling. And historically, a good example of this is the good old witch bottle. How all the material within the bottle was warmed, heated, and actually boiled with the urine inside. So, the bottle full of the nasties burned and boiled. The witch or the target was also then made to suffer. Now there is the representation. So our witch bottle, then the actual action of boiling it to cause corresponding distress in the target. So don't dismiss actually submerging something in that vat of boiling water or even cooking something. This actually appears a lot in folk magic and, of course, literary depictions of magic, like the image of the witch stirring her cauldron, the brewing of potions and magic. But magical and medicinal preparations were routinely boiled, simmered, steeped, reduced, and cooked. This is where that boundary of magic and medicine gets really intertwined, which I think is a good thing. But for example, in the Petit Albert, there are preparations which plants and other ingredients are actually heated in a bain marie or bain marie They are boiled, then exposed to sunlight and kept warm for extended periods of time. This is a really good example of using the process of cooking for transformation magic. You are using heat to turn one thing into another, just like when we bake a cake, or you can call it alchemy, whatever. Cooking, alchemy, transformation. And actually, with this, I think a lot about Agnes Sampson and how her trial confession talks about a very explicit example of a wax image being roasted, that of King James VI, which would have damaged or, destroyed the king himself as the wax did. And this is something still practiced, maybe not thought about, or I guess it is, but maybe I think a lot of newer practitioners maybe just do things that they are told or they see, but they get stumped on the actual path of growing within their practice because they fail to question why it's happening or why it works. Some answers are, of course, much easier than others. It's pretty obvious to understand why we could just take an image of someone and burn it and, stick an effigy of them into a fire or stick it with a bunch of needles, but it takes the extra step of understanding that is still a part of the magic, not just a means to the end of the working. Now, of course, more activity isn't always better, and there are plenty of situations where we want to cool things down. Now, honestly, you can heat something until it boils over. You can heat an argument until nobody's listening anymore, or the desire until it becomes obsession, and even heating a working until you've got so much activity surrounding it that you don't actually have any control over where the activity goes. So, like, example, when you heat up spirit activity too much. And that's where I think cooling becomes much more interesting, than simply saying that cold is the opposite correspondence of heat, because cooling doesn't necessarily mean destroying something. Sometimes making something freeze in place or make it come to a complete stop is inappropriate for that situation. And sometimes you just want to slow things down and keep them from trotting off too quickly. You don't necessarily want an end to an argument. Maybe you just want everyone to shut the fuck up long enough to actually think. And this is where it takes turning that dial very carefully and slowly, because destroying someone's desire completely obviously can't always be a good thing, right? It's most likely a bad thing. Maybe you want to actually just take the intensity out of it. You don't necessarily always want a spirit to be completely gone, but you want them to calm down. But of course, you do want something completely inaccessible and dormant. So there's layers and there are degrees to how you can work these temperatures into your magic. And despite the flooding witch talk or Pinterest boards on freezer spells, the idea that temperature, bodily activity, substances, and states could be understood through hot and cold has a very long history. Again, with language, just among each other, if we think about all the things that we actually hear and even apply to situations, it is present, keeping your cool, being cold hearted, or putting a person or situation on ice, the cold shoulder, which actually, funnily enough, at a coffee shop I worked at, we called a cold brew with an extra shot of espresso a cold shoulder because the hot version is, of course, known as a red eye. But anyway, I digress. I just always think of the coffee drink when I hear the cold shoulder. But when we hear the word cold, we are immediately associating things with inactivity, with stillness, and even distance and emotional withdrawal. There is a lack of vitality in life. And honestly, there's even preservation to be discovered within using cold in magic. Is the cooling in your magic about reducing something, stopping something, or changing its state entirely? That is really what it boils down to. Now, boils down. Now, of course, cooling things doesn't, always mean just physically. We know, and especially in magic, we know it is more often than not to slow something down. This can be reducing speed and intensity, cooling off your emotions that got too hot or climbed too high. If desire, again, becomes too much to handle at once, of course, working with cooling off anger and slowing movement or even communications between parties. And the cooling of spiritual activities, whether that is, a direct working on a spirit that you are entangled with, or just the general activity of a space or your own perception of things, have become too frequent to actually function. So cold does not always mean the elimination of something. It can be making things more manageable. Generally, I think of three different categories when it comes to this cooling magic. First is the general reducing or the intensity of things. Then we have freezing, which of course is just like the arresting of the movement of something. Then we have the extinguishing, so ending activity altogether. And they are subject to overlap, of course, but they all work differently. For example, you might want to stop a course of arguments, but you don't actually want to extinguish the relationship itself. You probably just want the argument actually, or conflicts, to be cooled off, not the relationship you have with that person to be on ice. Likewise, if trying to stop an unwanted spirit from pestering you, do you want the spirit gone entirely? Well, maybe sometimes, but maybe you just want its activity towards you to be reduced. You know, Water is a good way to actually work in some cooling magic. It is uh, actually used in plenty of situations, when dunking something or using the action of immersion into a cool pool of water or washing something off or sprinkling it with something, which can really settle things down. You always feel better when you take a cool bath or a shower. It's a way to feel neutral again. We do it ourselves as humans. You may wash certain statues or effigies in waters even infused with cooling botanicals and other materials, or return things to a cooling river or stream or well. Running or moving water is really helpful with washing things off. In actually the PGM, there is a restraining spell which uses immersion of water as a part of breaking a spell. So this involves actually making a lead plate made from lead, which was taken from a cold water channel to be inscribed and then thrown into a stream or the sea so it may be carried away. And on top of that, it's actually consecrated with bitter aromatics. So to break the spell, the cord attached to that plate is untied, and the magician is instructed to wash and immerse themselves, then to return to rest. Now, of course, there's a lot more to that entry, but I just wanted to at least tug on that part because it at least gives us understanding of the submersion and the use of, this cooling water really and bitter herbs for this deactivation and this transition and this washing of away. Now, water in itself within magical cooling, most importantly, can be used to cleanse, right? So, to carry away and dissolve matters, to remove and again extinguish, like throwing a bucket of water on a burning bush. Running water uses cooling by carrying something away, and washing uses cooling by that deactivation. And bathing, so it brings something back down from a heightened state to the neutral. Now, underground spaces too, like burying something in tombs, graves, even caves or places which, never ever get direct sunlight are definitely not to be dismissed. The ancient curse tablets even were, of course, frequently found in such underground spaces and locations, not only as maybe a way to silence the target, but to go through the act of burying them and closing them off from the world or submerging them into the cold soil or under rocks. But even as a way to handing them over to more chthonic powers and ghosts of the dead. It isn't simply about using cold things, but it's actually the manipulation of heat and activity or movement toward a colder state. That's why it's not just a category of, shoving something in the fucking freezer, which I guess if your goal is to freeze something or stop it dead in its tracks, well, you can use the freezer. But I would argue if you want to stop something dead in its tracks, definitely like use something with the dead. Go to the fucking cemetery. But it at least gives you the ability to pull them back out, thaw them, give them a few hard pokes and shaking around, then return them to their little cryo chamber. But on the subjects of cooling certain things, you know, there's emotions, of course, just like we can heat up emotions, we can cool emotions. So things like conflicts and desires. Anger is obviously very hot. We say someone is getting fired up, or their blood is boiling, or you have a hot temper. But when magically intervening, in a situation such as that, completely destroying the, I guess, circumstance is not only more likely to not work how you want or at all, because sometimes biting off more than you can chew within magic or even overworking something when it could have been done much easier at a lesser cost is something that should be more attractive, I guess, to practitioners in most cases, in my humble opinion. But I guess who cares about my opinion? So, bringing that temperature down is what we actually want because honestly, emotions exist for a reason, right? I would argue it's not really a good thing to completely get rid of it. However, if things are, again, out of balance, it should not overwhelm the situation so much that there's no room for movement or progression. Your goal should, to be to create enough space for the feeling and the action at the same time. And sometimes desire is just too much to handle. Maybe you even accidentally heated up the situation too much for you to handle. hmm Sometimes things just get out of hand and they can consume you, or obsession starts to roll in all the wrong ways. You want to introduce less compulsion, and that's a big one. Sometimes with too much heat backing an emotion, there is too much impulse, right? Because they or we want it right now. Cooling in that situation becomes the remedy for restoring choice. Now, on cooling communication, we find plenty of spells in ancient material designed not necessarily to destroy a person, but to interfere with their speech and their movement and their actions, or their ability to accomplish something. Now, not to overstate, because the texts don't actually give us a neat little equation of cold equals silence, but when you put cold material together with a magical operation whose purpose is to reduce something, it is difficult not to notice. And I just thought of this now, but back to the freezer spells and putting things on ice, sometimes all you really want is just a little more time, like the relation to wanting to create room for choice instead of being bombarded with all these emotions, and this heat and this moving forward and this agitation. Freezing something off or introducing a cooling element to your magic can actually gift you the moments of time slowed. Now, on the cooling of spirits, this, I guess, is not too hard to think about when you understand what it's actually like to heat one up. But again, sometimes you accidentally heat things up too much, or they can even get real fired up on their own and get the party rolling with no slowing down in sight. So reducing things like agitation or aggression or general activity should be in your arsenal when working with spirits, especially if they go and employ other spirits and then all their spirit friends like make a party and they just all mob. They're like, yeah, this is our bitch. Like, let's go protect her. And then it's just a big mess. But sometimes it's really just about slowing down the unwanted over interaction, but also their influence and the interference that they may have with your daily life and even attachments to you, or certain things you do or keep in the house, or when activity ramps up if you are around a certain person. Especially if you're not in your own home, I feel like it's more grounds for sure to negotiate more of a spirit's wants and needs within your own space because you actually control it on the material realm. Whereas if they start getting too picky with you on the outside and outside your home, it is more grounds to get the cattle stick and kind of buzz them back. I'm just kidding. Definitely don't get a cattle stick for your spirits, but you get my meaning. What's important is that the spirit doesn't need to be your enemy to cool them down. I think modern conversations about spirit work sometimes assume that if you're manipulating the condition of a spirit, you must be trying to dominate or banish it. But cooling can actually be a form of care. For example, calming the agitated entity brings a peace of mind to you in your home. No one wants an agitated spirit on their hands. And it's okay to give them space and even purposely reduce intensity after a larger working. Creating the rest and recovery is an act of care, in my opinion, when working with spirits and a part of maintaining a healthy relationship with them. It's like, what's that like freaky BDSM shit? There's like aftercare, that's called. Anyway, I probably just exposed myself, but I do want to mention cooling, of course, has its downsides. So, overcooling can create apathy and stagnation. Certain emotional numbness or isolations can start to creep in. And a general sign of all inactivities is more of a surefire sign of overcooling, whether with a spirit or directly result from a working. So maybe when working for a relationship, the cooling resulted in a much higher state of indifference than the peace that you actually wanted, or something slowed down so much that it actually killed the momentum, whether it be seeking a relationship or even job hunting. And of course, with spirits, the overcooling can just result in dormancy or disconnection. So, hot and cold applications to magic are in relation to the intensity and the activity. It's asking how much something is moving or how well it's moving, how much is actually happening or how forceful something is. But many times, situations that call for our intervention are not just about what is too active or not active enough, but if the odds are against you, if something is simply not favorable towards you, that's where I think the talk on sweetening and souring and bittering come into this. It's one thing to really cool off an enemy until they're quiet, but to make them actually turn and like you, that's some witchy shit right there. Turning the adversary who wants nothing but to fight you, have conflicts with you, just batter you in every way possible, and then suddenly give them a reason to want to cooperate with you and like grovel at your feet. Yep, that right there. So let's start with sweetness and on meaning to sweeten something, like deals and someone's disposition towards you. Sweeten them up to really get them to give you what you want. Sweetening the tongue with talks and whispers of affection. It is to make something favorable and agreeable. So, to sweeten something essentially is to make something pleasant and make it receptive to you or what you choose, with encouraging effortless cooperations and in turn softening any natural resistance. So, creating goodwill in things like cultivating a state of affection. Things like, I need my boss to like me, or the interviewer, or the car salesman. You can compel them, maybe work in some domination magic, and even confuse them and make them afraid to outside sources other than yourself or what you want them to be looking at. Even creating this sort of like state of confusion, it often keeps them open to easier manipulation. Naturally, people look for stability. So if the world around them seems off putting and confusing and unsure of themselves, and I don't know, you have a little wax candle of them in a nice warm spot in your window on a nice cloth bed, staring at your favorite picture of yourself, and you kiss it goodnight each night, you know, that brings the security of a routine of safety and nothing, frankly, to be confused about. But sweetening, of course, works the other way too. So making yourself pleasant to outside sources, not just manipulating the target. And the same with spirits. You don't necessarily need to command a spirit into doing something. Maybe you just flash your titties at them and they will be like, yeah, hell yeah, let's go. Or, of course, you can cultivate a relationship with the spirit who you want to cooperate and gift them and talk to them and truly befriend them. But, of course, gaining favors is much easier. The spirit itself becomes more agreeable and it even becomes more hospitable in your own home when you have guests or when you talk of other people around the spirit, and it will generally want to see you happy and help repair your relationships and make offerings back to you even more appealing when working together magically. But on sweetening yourself, this can be anything from your own speech and how you talk to others and how you look or smell when you walk into a room. It is more environmental manipulation, I guess. Your constant luck or your attractiveness from not just your looks, but your personality is what makes people gravitate. What makes them put that little $5 bill in the tip jar and not just a quarter you handed back to them. Now, it doesn't just have to be you or someone else or a spirit, but you can sweeten, of course, your job application, like the paper itself, negotiations, court situations, your finances, social encounters, even reconciliations, especially if you know one is coming. Take the time to actually sweeten it up a little bit for all parties involved. Now, on materia, honey is the most used and talked about for sure, and for good reason, and actually very much historically used, especially in the ancient Mediterranean, in Greece and Rome. Honey was not just an abundant sign of good eating, but a very important offering to the gods and spirits of the dead. Honey itself possesses sweetness and attraction to lots and lots of attraction, actually, to many creatures, but it is extremely nourishing and it is a strong preservative. It has a wonderful smell and it's sticky. Sweetening jars are popular in use here, and of course, you don't just have to use honey. You could use jam or maple syrup or just plain granulated sugar, but things like wines and perfumes and fragrant plants and honestly, even just general pleasant foods. If you take the time to bake and make a richly home cooked meal, these are all things that sweeten people up, sweeten things up, and allows this sort of guard or permanent wall that, quite frankly, we all kind of have to be let down. Desire actually gets a chance to slip in and give and receive in the same breath. Now, you can do workings with animal tongues and working with sweetening syrups onto them and other materia to, of course, sweeten speech and drenching copies of documents from court or job applications or business cards, and all the things that require great attention to detail to avoid overindulgence. Quickly with too much sweetening dependency can really grow in cloying behavior, which especially can form into an evil eye situation or a lack of boundaries. But I think it's definitely something not to be dismissed. Just sweetening can be worked into your magic in the smallest of ways and, of course, the biggest of ways. Now, I do just want to talk about souring and bittering too, which is just as useful. Now souring itself is not really attacking something, which sometimes it feels like it is, but it is usually to have the goal of making a relationship or condition begin to deteriorate. So souring brings an estrangement quality. Where bittering something can actually quickly bring aversion and hostility or rejection and resentment. Now, again, these things can overlap, but they have their own uniqueness to them for sure. Because a relationship can, say, be soured without either person becoming deeply hateful. It will just happen, or bitter brings a higher state of emotion to it. It's like when two people break up and it's very cordial, the relationship slowly soured over time. And then if people got bitter and they resented each other, then obviously things were a lot more nasty. But vinegar itself in magic is very rich in history, and I want to bring it up first because it's also very accessible. And it's, of course, been used in medicine for centuries and for purification and preservation, which in turn actually made it very accessible and found its way quickly into the hands of folk magic throughout time. Vinegar is so good at souring because one, it alters the taste of something pretty dramatically. It can dissolve certain things, and it is, of course, an irritant. Now, with souring, something can go from fresh to fermented to straight up sour and then spoiled. There are actually a lot of things you could use to sour something other than vinegar or lemon or, these sort of acids, but spoiled foods and rotten materials, get your hands on some milk, shove some stuff in there and let it curdle and sour and yeah, just get gross. Or even open up that bottle of wine that you got with your ex and let it oxidize and turn into a nasty little vinegary mess and go pour it on his lawn. I'm kidding. Don't actually do that. Don't ruin other people's property, but do it in your own little makeshift mini model at home because witches are fucking crazy. But souring something can go from, of course, romances and friendships to alliances and cooperations between people. For example, a hot discord will make them more active, and an argumentative one where it sours. This sort of discord will make the relationship gradually become more unpleasant. That is more or less the contrast. Now, if you're really evil, you can sour someone's opportunity for something or their relationship with a place, making a situation increasingly unpleasant for them. So, like, the more, not at first, but the more they go, it gets more and more unpleasant. Because honestly, sometimes you just need to make it stop being desirable. Like, there's so many different ways to do one thing. And yes, even souring can come in handy when it comes to spirits directly, because discouraging certain interactions or disrupting attachments, not a hard cutoff, but more of the act of, again, like the more you come here, the less you will like it, sort of thing. Or even working a souring element to direct the spirit to go and sour something for you. Now, there is an interesting sort of counterintuitive application I want to mention, which is souring your own attachment to something. So, for example, becoming disillusioned, breaking an unhealthy fixation, making an obsession less attractive, and changing your own perception of something is really worth exploring. Heat is really immediate and cooling can be too, but something about souring implies a process. It changes and it deteriorates naturally, whether the fact that you put the vinegar there was natural or unnatural. The process itself is still the same. This makes it really useful for slow estrangements, a gradual loss of interest in really long term relationships. Now, finally, I want to chat on bittering. Not too much, but just enough. Because bittering something produces rejection, and it's important to know the key differences, I think, between souring and bittering. Now, really, to start off, bitter herbs are, of course, things that we all will have if you're a witch who works with plants and herbs. And they're really quite good for you in digestion. So, things like bitter roots and tonics and tinctures. But, you can use these how you see fit. I guess that's my point. It is interesting that bitter substances are so heavily represented in medicine because it had a more direct effect on the body. So, bitter makes the desirable undesirable, right? It implies an aversion like disgust and resentment and sometimes even hostility because something is so freaking gross. it just makes you angry. Bittering a relationship, for example, can make people highly dissatisfied with each other and even make someone lose their taste for the relationship. The affection doesn't just sour and deteriorate, but it actually develops an active aversion to it. And honestly, when applying it to yourself or something else, it's useful for unwanted attention or unwanted romantic advances and social contact. You might genuinely want people to lose their appetite for interacting with you. I know I do sometimes. Or I guess someone specifically or something else. You know, Things like working in bitter offerings and unpleasant things to spirits directly, whether it's for your relationship to them or a part of the larger working and goal in which you want them to do something else to someone else. You can use substances that repel certain things or keep things at bay. That's even useful for working in bitter herbs for protection. And this can just mean making the thing the enemy is fixated on to be very undesirable, to lose interest or really see it as not worth it. There is a conceptual relationship worth exploring within bittering magic between things that are repulsive or downright unpalatable. Many little buggies in nature, for example, taste absolutely rank and bitter, not because I've tasted them, but because I've been told that they taste bad because they don't want to be eaten. It's the same thing with plants. It's just nature. And finally, bittering yourself. And I really like to explore all options in magic during times of need, whether going after the outside source or influencing the inside one. Many times it's easier to just change your own habits and actually do magic on yourself for certain situations. And you can bitter yourself against many things like unhealthy relationships or destructive habits or temptations or recurring behaviors. Instead of making yourself stronger than the temptation, make the temptation itself less attractive. Or if it's specifically about a person or a relationship, I personally see nothing wrong with choosing to make yourself so intensely unattractive to someone that you no longer want in your life to make them choose to walk away themselves rather than dealing with all the freaking drama and whatever else comes with it if you were to do it yourself. Some unconventional options are worth exploring for the ease of it. It's very much like akin to like a glamour magic. It's not always about making one option more attractive to the person and, kind of alluring them towards it, but it can also be very useful to make the option that you don't want them to pick or situation that you don't want them to pick look so intensely unattractive that you don't even have to worry about it. That you don't have to worry about what they are going to choose. You're just going to worry about what they're not going to choose. But to say the least, with bittering things, the primary direction or action of it is to repel. And results can vary from aversion to rejection and hostility. Souring deteriorates and causes discord and unpleasantness, where sweet is all about the favorable. It's about attraction and cooperations and getting your way with affection as your main weapon. And cold decreases and brings calm and stillness and suppression and yes, even being dead in your tracks and completely freezing a situation. And this sort of slowness and heat inflames, it increases activity and it brings passion and urgency and um, hotness and it provokes situations and people and emotions. Now, the great thing about all of these, on top of all the other things when it comes to making magic and spells and layering and all that fun stuff, combined and used at different degrees within magic, there is a part that is a lot of fun about mixing and matching these when actually creating your spells. So, for example, like a cold and bitter would create a sort of detached rejection, and hot and sour can mean escalating conflict, or even cold and sweet can bring calm affections and a softer reconciliation. There's so many layers to magic, and this episode I wanted to do on the conditions and dispositions, I guess, was one that I wanted to have a lot of fun with, and I actually did, and talk a lot about just technicalities. And it's not just subject to spells themselves, this stuff can work and really should be working sometimes with your relations to spirits. Think about uh, cultivating and creating certain environments which make your spirits work a certain way that you want them to. Now, that is all I have for now on all the conditions or temperatures of magic, I guess. I genuinely hope, this episode brought some creative thinking to you all. And I thank everyone who has joined me today and stayed to the end. Thank you. It really, really helps. I'm so happy that we're growing every single day. I look and there's just more of you, and it definitely brings me joy, especially now. I love creating more magic and having more conversations, and there will be more. So, as always, I will see you next time, and wherever you are in the world, have a wonderful morning, day, or night.